Thank you all for coming, and welcome to the 25th year of the Clark Fork Symposium. This symposium this year is dedicated to the workers at the Smurfit Stone plant, who, like the river, I guess, have worked very hard over the years. And, you know, oddly enough, it's also the 25th anniversary of the Clark Fork Coalition, an organization that started in response to wastewater conditions at the plant. And, you know, it's sad to see a plant like that go down when over the years they became cleaner and cleaner and cleaner and ultimately were a good corporate citizen. So we were mourning the fact that that mill closed. The co-sponsors of the symposium are listed here, and we're grateful, of course, for their support. Without them, we wouldn't have the food, we wouldn't have the field trip vehicles, and the volunteers. Thank you, Vicki. So the first speaker here tonight is Vicki Watson, and she will present a State of the River report. After that, we'll have a slideshow by Joel Chavez, who is the project coordinator at Silverbow Creek, and followed by another slideshow by Diana Hammer, who is the coordinator of the Milltown site. And finally, at the end, we will be entertained by Rick Bass, who will be helping us envision what the Clark Fork watershed might look like 25 years in the future. So the theme of this, I guess, since we're on the 25th year, is looking back and looking forward. So Vicki, to introduce her, she was born on a small family farm on the Texas prairie, and she grew up watching her parents try to save a small stream on their land that was being affected by wastewater dumping upstream. And if you know Vicki, that explains a lot. So it's not surprising then that she went on to study aquatic ecology in Madison, Wisconsin, and she came to the University of Montana in 1983. Actually, when she came here, I was a young graduate student, and Ron Erickson, who was the department chair at the time, said, well, you know, when you're evaluating the candidates for this job, don't just think about teaching and research, but think about the person that we're bringing in. Think about the person that we're bringing to the community and what that might mean, because they'll probably be here for a while. And so, you know, Vicki was hired, and Ron was right. You know, Vicki has been, as many of you in this room know, tireless in her service to the Clark Fork ecosystem. So she's, you know, as a professor, you're supposed to be involved in teaching, research, but then service is also a part of the job. And Vicki has really taken that service to heart, and for that, we are grateful. So with that, Vicki.
Well, I know everybody's already seen me giving the zombie wave, as the students call it. Had to have some work done on the hand, hasn't turned out too well, and so I'm supposed to keep it elevated and continually moving. And so you'll sometimes see students walking across campus like this, giving the zombie wave after they've just seen me go by. And I guess my take-home message for this is don't get old and don't have a certain operation. I'm going to be giving the State of the Basin report, and I need to acknowledge in advance that this slowed me down quite a lot, but an awful lot of people stepped up and offered a lot of slides, so it's an interesting kind of collage of slides, many sent to me by Chris Brick, and occasionally I may stop and say, Chris, what is the slideshow again? But other people who I'll kind of mention as I go along. So I'm going to be talking a bit about, you know, current conditions in the river, some of the challenges the river faces, and some of the actions that have been taken. I hope I won't steal too much thunder from the people coming tomorrow to speak. I hope I'll essentially get you a little excited about coming tomorrow and hearing some of those talks. Two presentations that I felt were really important to make as available as possible to a wider audience than may come tomorrow. I call the transformation of Silverbow Creek and the transformation of Milltown. And we're very happy to have here tonight well, maybe the fairy godfather of Silverbow Creek and the fairy godmother of Milltown, two people who had an important role in transforming those sites, and they've got some very interesting slides to show us to see how those have changed. So I'm going to struggle through the technology here, and the first thing I'm going to find out is which way this arrow goes. Ah, the arrow goes that way. Good. Oh, let's get this down to the height of a short person. That's a good idea. I'm going to see if I can. Well, I was hoping to get this over where I could actually see this. State of the Basin report would again take a look at the current condition of the basin and its many water bodies. Are we achieving our goals here, both our ecological goals and our legal goals with respect to water quality, fisheries, and supporting the beneficial uses of the water? We'll do some looking at some trends, whether things are getting better or worse. We'll think some about some of the challenges that the basin faces, particularly population growth and associated development and all the increased demands for water and roads and so on. What a kind guy he is. Hey, thank you very much. In connection, an interesting topic to bring up is the topic of climate change. It has become controversial, although in the scientific community it's not terribly controversial, but it's still controversial. So I've changed the word climate change into climate challenge. And I think that even those who might question whether or not there is human-induced climate change going on, they don't question the fact that climate change occurs. It always has. It has for a long time, and it always will take place. And as the climate changes, or even in a natural sense, and many of us are convinced that it's also changing as a result of human activities, but even if it's simply fluctuating through its natural extremes, those natural extremes of drought and associated fire and flood, as there are more and more people in the basin, those extremes become more and more difficult and challenging. When we have drought, there are more people demanding more water, and so drought becomes an even more difficult challenge to meet. Similarly, as there are more people building on more land, then the inevitable floods and the possible greater floods will present greater and greater challenges for keeping people safe and protecting the river and the valuable river services that are performed by our floodplains and riparian areas. So we're going to mention some of those kinds of challenges and then spend a lot of time talking about what some of the many actions that have been going on to deal with those challenges. The many students who helped compile the data to create this slide are going to be mortified that I shrunk it down to as few numbers as appears up there, but for the 2000 State of the Basin report and the 2004 State of the Basin report, I summarized information from DEQ's water quality assessment database. I found the older database easier to use and was able to quickly, pull the numbers together. I'm finding their new database more difficult to use, and so I conscripted a whole platoon of graduate students to plow through. Each one took a sub-basin and plowed through looking at all of the streams and lakes in the sub-basins and summarizing information about use support for the various beneficial uses within those basins. And they not only did 2008, but they went back in time to sort of check my older numbers. So as a requirement of the Clean Water Act, every other year, each state is to do an assessment of the water quality and the beneficial use support of water bodies in the state. In Montana, we have an awful lot of water bodies and a not very large Department of Environmental Quality. So in any one of these assessment years, they usually assess about 10% of the basin's stream miles. And from year to year, it's mainly the same stream miles that are being assessed and reassessed, the ones that are thought to have a problem. A few new ones get added periodically, and by now this database, which is called the Clean Water Act Information Center database, includes about 15% of the stream miles in the basin. And so 85% of the stream miles in the basin have never been assessed, but 15% of them have, and in any given assessment year, about 10% of them are assessed. And this use support is looking at those that have actually been assessed. And so 85%, 90 to 85% we don't know, and this is the smaller percent that we do know what their use support is. And here it is summarized again for 2000, 2004, and 2008. Those that were considered to be impaired, a very high percentage were considered to be impaired back in 2000. There was some changes in terms, primarily changes in terms of what level of data quality and certainty was needed to make a use assessment. And given that that was toughened up by quite a bit, a lot of the streams that had formerly been considered impaired by 2004 were now described as insufficient data to say for sure. So you'd see that impaired category shrink and the insufficient data category grew. And then by 2008, they've been back and reassessed most of those streams using this, or meeting the criteria for sufficient data, and therefore a very small percentage of those streams would be considered to have insufficient data to make a judgment. So in 2000, 80% impaired, 2004, 55%. That's not all improvement. A lot of that, again, is redefining the quality of data required to make that judgment. And then by 2008, after going back and looking at them and, taking the necessary data to make a judgment, we see we're back up to 77% again. Sort of like we were right the first time, I guess DEQ could say. For full support, from 7% to 14% to 22%. And once again, keep in mind that if we're looking at 2008, for instance, that represents only about 10% of the streams. And so if we were to do this on all the streams in the basin basis, we would say about 8% are impaired, 2% are fully supporting, and the other 90%, we don't know. They haven't been assessed. The most frequently impaired uses are, first and foremost, the cold water fishery. That was the one that was most often listed as impaired. Sometimes all of the others would be fully supporting, except for the cold water fishery. But the aquatic life was impaired almost as often as the cold water fishery was, and drinking water and swimming were less often, but particularly in lake environments, they were more often impaired than the other two uses. The most common causes of impairment throughout the basin are habitat and flow alteration including diverting of water resulting in dewatering of the stream, and or the damming of water and creating slow flow conditions. Habitat alteration primarily includes disturbance of the stream banks, loss of streamside vegetation, things of that sort. And then in the water column itself, excessive amounts of silt or metals or nutrients are common causes of impairment. The sources of these problems have been identified as resource extraction, agricultural activities, silvicultural activities, hydromodification, which includes, again, damming and diverting, and construction practices near the stream. I mentioned again here the data source of this is DEQ's Water Quality Assessment Database called CWAC, and all the recent data has been compiled by a whole bunch of U of M students. There you are, guys, thanks. If we turn that information into a map, this is what it looks like. Again, the streams in blue, all their uses are fully supported. In red, one or more uses is not fully supported, and gray has not been assessed or insufficient data. And it's a little bit hard to see all those gray streams up there, but the vast majority of the streams are gray, and the next biggest group is red for impaired, and a fairly small group listed as all uses are fully supported. Again, this information comes from DEQ's every other year integrated water quality report. This is the latest report, and the map was produced by Jerry Dahlmiller of INRIS in the State Library, who is always very kind to draw any map I ask him to draw. We are working away on addressing these impaired uses through a process called the TMDL process. That stands for Total Maximum Daily Load. It was a requirement of the Clean Water Act that if water bodies are impaired, the state water quality agencies are to develop a plan for each one that takes into account the total amount of loading they can handle and still support their beneficial uses. So that's why it's called a TMDL analysis and plan. And here is where we are in terms of getting the getting those TMDLs produced. I'm going to try turning. Oh, yay! It comes out. So the in blue, they're under development. In green, they've already been submitted to the EPA. And in the duller green, there's a fully approved TMDL or watershed plan. So we see the Flathead headwaters and the Swan and the Middle Blackfoot, the Blackfoot headwaters. Over here, St. Regis and Prospect and the Bitterroot headwaters and 9 Mile. Here and there, Upper Lolo. Those are already approved and beginning to work on implementing those plans. The bright green ones, the Lower Blackfoot, have been submitted to EPA. I think I just heard that the Upper Clark Fork Tributaries TMDL has been submitted now, too. And all those in blue are under development, and those in purple have begun the process of planning to do those TMDLs. And then there's just a few where we're not very far along doing anything yet. And of course, the big brown area in the middle, that's tribal land, and they're following their own sort of process. Another thing we can look at in the basin to get an idea of how things are doing is our friends, the macroinvertebrates, the little bugs that live in the river. Some of them are very sensitive to poor water quality conditions, and if there are poor water quality conditions, they tend to not be there, and others are more tolerant of water quality conditions. And so the aquatic invertebrates are sampled in the river. They get sorted by bug taxonomists into the water quality sensitive ones and the water quality tolerant ones. And if the samples are dominated by water quality sensitive bugs, they get a high biointegrity score. And if they are dominated by poor water quality tolerant bugs, they get a low biointegrity score. And to judge that score, the streams that you fear are in trouble are compared to reference streams, the least impacted streams of a similar nature in the same ecoregion. And so the biointegrity scores of these reference streams are used to help interpret the biointegrity scores of more impacted streams. Using that approach and looking at a very long-term database that I believe was put together by the EPA, sampling in connection with the Superfund work, and I believe the analysis has for the most part been performed by the same person over time. Looking at Silverbow Creek, it's improved slightly over the 24 years that they've been looking at it, from severely impaired, that is scoring about 35 to 45% of what really high quality streams would score, to moderately impaired, scoring about 50 to 55%. The Mill Willow bypass, which runs beside the Warm Springs ponds, was cleaned. The tailings were removed, and the area underwent a restoration-like process to naturalize the stream that flows through there. That was done in the mid-1990s, and it is now scoring above 90%, so it would be considered unimpaired, even though it's totally rebuilt by people, you might say. Well, the river helped too by washing water through it. Below Warm Springs Ponds, and the stretch of the river there below Warm Springs Ponds, currently scores slightly impaired, and this has declined slightly in recent years, and it's attributed to eutrophication of the ponds. They continue to receive nutrient loading from towns upstream. The main stem of the Clark Fork from the mouth of Warm Springs Creek down to below Missoula, including below Milltown. For the first time, that stretch, all the stations now score as unimpaired, at least as far as aquatic invertebrates are concerned. That's not the only basis for determining impairment, but this particular measure of impairment would say that it's unimpaired. You might still look at cold water fishery and conclude, for instance, that it was still impaired. Speaking of the cold water fishery, the last couple of symposia, I used the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks MFISH database to assess the condition of streams as far as the fisheries are concerned. Looking at the streams throughout the basin, did they score as a very high quality fishery, a moderate quality fishery, a low quality fishery? And there are the scores from 2000 and 2005. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is in the process of developing a new database, and we had hoped that we were going to get a demonstration of it tomorrow. I'm not sure that's going to happen unless Pat Saffel decides to step into the breach and do that, but you can hear about that new database. But what I was told is that there's not been a great deal of change since 2005, and therefore we can just say the numbers are pretty similar at this point. But that new database is going to be up and usable and available sometime in the next couple of months, I think. So going on to the challenges, again, the challenge of population growth and development in the basin and how that interacts with the climate challenges of drought, fire, and flood, especially if those are indeed responding to climate change and becoming more and more severe. Clark Fork Basin population has been growing from 1979 to 2008, the two really rapidly growing parts of the basin, and the ones that represent most of the population are Missoula and Flathead counties. Silverbow is also a pretty large part of the population, but that population has actually been going down. Ravalli County is now come up and passed Silverbow County in terms of its population. And Lake County is also growing. The other counties, for the most part, are fairly stable or even showing a little bit of a loss of population. People who do population growth just love to make these animated maps. And so here's one that shows, and I wonder if it would help to dim the lights just a little bit. If our helper guy is up there, he might pull the lights down a little bit. But it shows the starting back in, let's start over again, in 1960 and going up to 2050, and sort of demonstrating the land area covered with various densities of development. And the one that you see expanding the most is this very low density, 1 unit per 10 to 40 acres, but that still represents roads and disturbance of wildlife habitat and disturbance near streams. In fact, this is probably where a lot of the development right near streams is occurring in these really low density areas. So there it is. You get to watch the yellow spread of low density development. And another group of geographers who love to make these animated GIS maps have again shown density of development and the projections every 10 years from, well, we'll wait till it gets back around to the beginning again here. 1940. From 1940 up to 2030, jumping through about every 10 years or so. And you see again that tremendous development in, thank you, David, in western Montana, particularly up around the Flathead Lake and down in Ravalli County and around Missoula. These are areas that have changed a lot and are expected to change still more in coming years, presenting a challenge. Another way to get a handle on growth. This was produced by John Lefebvre in the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, using information from the Groundwater Information Center there. And he actually produced a series of maps, but I decided to just use the last one. If you go clicking through them, you'll see it looks like a kind of a mildew is spreading through the Clark Fork here as more and more wells are drilled. Maybe he'll include this in his talk, and you'll get to sort of see the mildew grow as he clicks through those years. But if you look over there at the bar graph of number of wells in the Clark Fork Basin and see how it's grown from 1975 up until 2010, and from 1975 to 2005, it increased nearly fourfold, doubled twice. It's slowed down a little bit since then. The doubling time is not quite as short as it was earlier. And the other thing to notice about this is that 86% of these wells are domestic wells, so that means there's probably a septic system with each of those wells as well, if you want to think about how the septic systems have increased over time. Big challenge. And now starting to look at some of the climate effects. This is a series of slides that's in a report the Clark Fork Coalition produced called Low Flows Hot Trout, and there are copies of that outside that you can grab. Again, the concern expressed by climate scientists that we've, the last decade or so, has had many of the hottest years on record. At least, of course, we've only had historical records for a fairly short period of time. But we're seeing changes in temperature that are much more rapid than long-term geological records suggest. And so this is looking here in the Missoula, Kalispell, and Butte area, and since 1950, the average annual temperature has increased by about 2 degrees in Missoula and Butte and about a degree in Kalispell. And when you consider Western North America in general, that's Missoula and Butte at least is slightly more than what has happened through most of Western North America. It's more like about 1.5 degrees over the last 50 years. The climate scientists are predicting as much as 5 degrees or more over the next 100 years. And that would certainly change what we expect to experience here in Montana. Something that is already considered to have happened is that our growing season has shifted, where our hardiness zones have shifted by a full zone since 1970, 15 more frost-free days in the past 50 years, which may sound like more ripe tomatoes, but can also mean more insect infestations and a lot of changing other conditions that the native plants and animals are not adapted to. So in addition to temperature change, there's the change in precipitation. This analysis suggests that we haven't seen a change in overall total precipitation, but a lot less of it comes as snow. It tends to come as rainfall instead. And snow, of course, constitutes a wonderful long-term natural storage of water up in the mountains that's gradually released over the summer to keep the streams flowing. If you don't have that big storage of snow, and if it all falls as rain instead, then it comes on down and through the system and is not there to keep the streams flowing. What are we at now? We're at something like 50% of normal, or 50% of the long-term average for this year. So that means we lose the big snowfields, we lose glaciers, and again, they're important for providing that storage through the summer. And we wind up with the hotter fish because the streams are warmer, and this graph shows the number of days that the water temperature rose above either 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 70 degrees Fahrenheit from 95 to 2007. And there does seem to be something of an increasing trend of a greater and greater number of days spent above those very stressful levels for fish. And some suggestion that the fish populations are responding to it in that in Rock Creek at least, we seem to be seeing this shift over from rainbow trout to more high temperature tolerant brown trout. Several things contribute to dewatering streams. One is hotter temperatures, less water stored as snow. It all comes down in a big flush in the spring, and it's not there to fill the streams later, and greater demands by people taking more and more water. As a result, you wind up with chronically dewatered streams, and we already have a lot in our basin, 38 miles in the Blackfoot, 17 miles in the Bitterroot, 87 miles in the Upper Clark Fork, according to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And again, hotter days ahead and more people demanding more water ahead. Another result of hotter, drier summers is more and more fires. And a very kindly person in the DNRC, Donna Reby, drew these maps for me just to show you how much of the basin has burned in various years. We've seen, long periods of fire suppression and some hotter, drier summers. We're seeing some very large areas of fire. And when you have a very big percentage of the basin burned at a time, as you see there in the headwaters of the Bitterroot, for instance, that can be a pretty dramatic effect on fish populations. Certainly, the forests are adapted to fire, the fisheries are adapted to a certain amount of fire, but when they're already suffering from several kinds of stress, and maybe you have just a few populations left in a few areas and they happen to get hit with a big fire, then you have loss of the remaining. Some of the refuges are up in these higher elevation areas, and some of those have gotten hit with some pretty big fires in recent years. And particularly from 2000 to 2004, we had some extraordinary large areas of fire. Another response to warmer years is some insect infestations that might be controlled by really cold winters or seem to be moving further north. A number of invasive exotic species are moving north, and so pine beetle has been increasing. This is the western Montana in red and Region 1 in green, and so we're just, in terms of seeing new infestations, they've been rising, and this is an accumulative graph, but just new ones seen each year. Donna also drew me a nice, she drew a nice series of graphs. Again, I only put the last one up there, but it started out, the first graphs just had a few points on them, and as you go clicking through them, next thing you know, the whole thing is covered with mildew again, which in this case is the cumulative beetle presence in Montana west of the Continental Divide. So we now have this areas of dead trees from beetle infestations really widespread throughout the basin. Just by way of mentioning concern about flooding, again, if more water falls as rainfall rather than as snow, and maybe that rain falls on snow at the end of the season, we get these rain on snow events, and the result is higher flood flows and lower flows in summer later on. So with these predictions of more severe floods and more people moving to the area and moving into floodplains, we need to be able to plan to protect those floodplain areas. And thankfully, DNRC, working with other agencies, are producing new digital flood maps. And some parts of the basin, they're already available and in use. In much of the basin, they are in production and expected to be out in the next few years. And they will be actually available online for anyone to use. And you can use Google Earth to access these new floodplain maps. So meeting the challenges with actions, you're going to see many examples throughout the symposium of meeting these challenges with actions. We're going to see a couple of them tonight. R&R in this case stands for Remediation and Restoration of Silverbow Creek and also of Milltown at the Two Rivers Confluence. We'll be hearing from Joel Chavez and Diana Hammer later. Conservation and restoration actions require planning to be successful. You can do more harm than good if you go rushing out with backhoes and poorly selected plant materials. You can actually do more harm than good. We heard earlier today about some important plans at the Watershed Roundtable. Gerald Mueller talked about the Clark Fork Watershed Management Plan, Brian McDonald, the Blackfoot Drought Plan, and Karen Miskey, the Flathead Aquatic Invasive Species Management Plan. So planning is also action. We have to get that done before we rush out there with heavy equipment and biological materials. Tomorrow, you'll be hearing about bringing back the Upper River from a whole host of entities that are working in the Upper River, the Clark Fork River Technical Advisory Committee, DEQ's Mine Remediation Bureau, Natural Resource Damage Program, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, DEQ working through their TMDL process and 319 grants, and a landowner who's also part of the Watershed Restoration Coalition. They're going to be talking about what they're doing and how they're coordinating with one another. We're also going to hear some reports on some very long-term studies, including long-term studies of Flathead Lake by Bonnie Ellis from the biostation, a report on the voluntary nutrient reduction program that went for 10 years by the VNRP coordinator, Will McDowell, and 25 years of butte cleanup. People have been trying to clean up butte a lot longer than that, but they're going to be talking about cleaning up butte priority soils. In the afternoon, there are posters and displays to see. There are so many short talks, we had to put them in 5 sessions of 5 to 6 papers each. And one session's looking at whole basin studies, another one looking at the upper river tributaries, and that's supposed to be an and sign. I'm not sure why that dollar sign got in there. Upper river tributaries in Milltown, upper river Superfund, especially Silverbow Creek, the middle and lower Clark Fork, and then the middle and lower river tributaries. Many of these talks and posters describe studies that were done to guide conservation and restoration actions, studies of those conservation and restoration actions. Do they seem to be working? If they were done some time ago, are they successful? Did they create other kinds of problems? And studies of how the basin is reacting physically, chemically, and biologically to these challenges of growth and climate change and invasive species. I do want to mention on Friday evening, this is something you may want to take in after the symposium is over, a film documentary called Living Downstream. Can you tell me a little bit of what it's about, Chris? The Living Downstream? Okay. I think it is about the study she did after she got cancer and looked into the various environmental causes of cancer, and she turned that into this documentary. It is one night only, and this is the premiere of the film, I believe. It's at the Wilma at 7. The sponsors are Environmental Studies, Clark Fork Coalition, Women's Voices for the Earth. And those of you who have been who brought your own water bottles and got in on the Waste Not raffle prize, one of the fabulous prizes is 2 tickets to this, as well as there are some other fabulous raffle prizes as well. Back to actions. These will be described in upcoming talks, and I don't want to steal too much of the thunder of others. I want to just mention one effort that I was most involved with, and that was this 10-year effort to reduce nutrient loading and nuisance algae growth in the Clark Fork, called the Voluntary Nutrient Reduction Plan. And again, Will McDowell will be talking about that in detail tomorrow. This was a plan that was agreed to by state and local government and major dischargers. Some of the things that were done, the city of Missoula did several things to reduce its nutrient loading to the river. And here's where I should put this back. But I haven't quite figured out how to hold this and this at the same time with one hand. Oh, okay. I have a robot pointer here who's going to point at things like the phosphate detergent ban that was enacted in 1988 with a big plunge in phosphorus loading. We've got nitrogen loading in green and phosphorus loading in blue here. So the phosphate detergent ban caused a drop in phosphorus levels. Through time, the number of people in Missoula connected to the sewer has been rising from back in 1988 12,000 to, by 2009, 28,000. So it's not too surprising to see this rising amount of nutrients coming out of the sewage plant. A rising amount of nutrients was coming into the sewage plant. But the phosphate detergent ban caused a big drop. In addition, they begin to operate the plant. They begin to experiment with the operation to make it behave somewhat like a biological nutrient removal plant. And they actually got some drop in phosphorus in particular in the years that they were doing that. But then in about 2004, the plant was upgraded to an advanced secondary biological nutrient removal system, and we see a big drop in both nitrogen and phosphorus at that point. And it's amazing even to hold the line when you have that much of an increase in population, but we actually have dropped the amount of loading. Some other reductions in point sources. These are some of the point sources that worked to reduce their load and how much they reduced it from 1988 to 2008. For the most part, pretty significant reductions in loading. There's a little increase in nitrogen loading in Butte. I don't know if they started drinking more beer there or what that's all about. But the total load dropped 18% for nitrogen and 66% for phosphorus. A lot of that drop was due to the Missoula wastewater treatment plant. And of course, that only benefits the river downstream of Missoula. It doesn't reduce loading to the upper river. So if we advance, I'm the one doing the advancing. We did see drops in nitrogen concentration in the river at most stations along the river, and drops in phosphorus loading. So we've got the late 80s in dark green, the late 90s in light green, and then fairly recently in yellow, dropping down. It looks like a big improvement. As soon as you get the statisticians involved, they start questioning whether these are significant changes given all the variability that's out there. But we just sort of put the statisticians in the closet and go ahead and look at our bar graphs instead. But looking on to, one of the reasons we were controlling nutrients was to try to reduce the levels of nuisance algae in the river. And this summarizes over the period of the VNRP, what percent of samples were in compliance at these stations along the river, and what was the trend from 1998 to 2008. And in the upper river, about 29% were in compliance. Below Missoula, almost the same percent. And further down the river, the majority of samples were in compliance. It's always been kind of low down there. Over the course of this effort, the levels in the upper river have actually increased. Below Missoula, they have significantly decreased, and then further down the river, they've stayed at about the same level. And I would argue that it's actually, given population growth, it's something to even hold the line, and certainly to see that decrease below Missoula. The reasons for the increase in the upper river, I think, are that we've had some lower flow years, and a lot of the upper river's algae levels are controlled by scour of the river, and so they haven't been scoured away. We've been investing quite a lot in restoration and conservation in the basin, so we're putting our money where our mouth is, or we're putting somebody's money where our mouth is. And I had a very similar slide to this in 2005, and Chuck Dalby nicely has done some more research and updated it for me so that you can see what Vista's been spending on dam mitigation, the cost of that VNRP program, an estimate of NRDP restoration already spent or already committed to spend, Superfund spending, and what the Forest Service is spending on their watershed restoration programs, what the tribes have spent, DNRC projects, FWP projects, DEQ 319 projects. It adds up to about $1.33 billion, which sounds like a lot of money until you realize that's just a few days of expenditures in some of the wars that we're in. And this seems like this is buying us a lot more security than that. And there's actually more money if you consider what NRCS spends on watershed projects and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the many watershed groups and individuals, the blood, sweat, and tears that they put into watershed projects. Something we got into, looking back 25 years, we started putting together a chronology of important events in the Clark Fork, and we've got some posters out there that we've asked people to add their own things to. And I should thank those people that have flooded my mailbox in the last few weeks with, many suggestions for such events. I could put together dozens and dozens of those big posters, and we will put together a big chronology of all these events, but I had to pick a certain number of them to show tonight. Some of the things that happened before the 1980s, everything from floods that washed mine waste down the river to the construction of the Warm Springs ponds. The creation of the conservation districts was a very important event for all watersheds everywhere. The dams that were built on the lower river and on the Flathead, the opening of the Frenchtown Mill, the building of the highway, which shortened the river, the passing of the Clean Water Act that required improved treatment. For the Clark Fork, very important, ARCO, big, deep pockets, buying Anaconda. 1975, the tailings pond that broke and contaminated the Blackfoot, and the passage of the Natural Streambed and Banks Protection Act, which is very important to all streams in Montana. In the 80s, Superfund law was passed and the Anaconda smelter closed. Arsenic contamination discovered at Milltown began to designate the Superfund sites on the Clark Fork. The Butte Mine Works shut down. The Montana filed the damage lawsuits against ARCO. We had the first Clark Fork Symposium. Mises shrimp exploded in Flathead Lake. Nobody blew them up. Their populations increased. Missoula enacted its phosphate ban, but we were Johnny-come-latelys. Flathead and Lake counties had banned phosphate detergents earlier. In the 90s, the Warm Springs ponds and the Mill Willow bypass were overhauled because of the fish kills that had happened in the late 80s. The Anaconda area rods were completed. NRDP was created, the Natural Resource Damage Program. The entire upper river was designated a Superfund site. The tribes intervened and got in on this process so that they could also be involved in remediation and restoration work. The Upper Clark Fork Task Force adopted a water management plan. It's primarily a drought plan. Bull trout were listed as threatened and their critical habitat designated in the basin. The voluntary nutrient reduction plan took place, and Silverbow Creek remediation began and settlement of some of the suits. In the 2000s, well, the dam relicensing began before this, but there was some dam relicensing at this time, and the new licenses required fish and wildlife plans and a lot of mitigation. NRDP started their restoration grants program. The tribe completed their habitat and bull trout restoration plan. The restoration of Silverbow Creek began because the remediation part was completed. Rods for many of the Superfund sites were completed. Those are the records of decision, the decision about what we're going to do. The Clark Fork Basin Task Force developed the Clark Fork Basin Water Plan. We decided what we were going to do at Milltown. Missoula upgraded to that nutrient removal plant. Some of our NRD suits got settled so we can move forward on those. The last train to opportunity left Milltown with mine waste. Flathead Basin developed their invasive species management plan, and the tribe somewhere in there completed their the restoration work that they were going to do under the consent decree. We're not very far into 2010 and already have some big milestones: the Frenchtown Mill closing, BC banning mining and energy development on the North Fork of the Flathead, and the MOU they signed with Montana to protect that area. The Northwest Power Planning Council deciding that we don't need any more coal and we can meet our energy needs with only conservation and renewable energy. I'm sure you can add lots more to this. If I had to pick what I thought were some of the three most exciting things out of all this to mention, one would be that in 2008, after 100 years, native trout swim through the restored Two Rivers confluence. We'll be hearing more about that in a moment. And also in 2008, after 100 years, native trout returned to Silverbow Creek. But my favorite, the top one, would be that we have seen the birth of a watershed movement and culture in the basin. For the basin to remain healthy, it's not just a matter of going out and doing these big spectacular projects, but the fact that there's going to be continued problems and challenges, population growth, climate change. We're going to have to continue to take care of the basin. I sometimes say that watershed keeping is like housekeeping. It's never over, it's never done. You have to just keep doing it day in and day out, and look at at all these groups that have formed over the years to take care of their watersheds. You see some really early on up there, even before the 1980s, quite a few that formed in the 1990s, and still more from 2000 to 2010. Many, many watershed groups have formed, and we thank all of them for the time they've already put in and the time they're going to be putting in the future to take care of these basins. And speaking of births, I did want to welcome to the world in the watershed Renee Meyer's new little watershed helper who joined us recently. Does anybody know the name? I thought there might be somebody that knows Renee. Renee is the coordinator for the Watershed Restoration Coalition, and she was originally thought about helping out with and she said, you know, I have a baby due just a few days before the conference. Maybe I'd better not take too big a role in that. So that's all that I had to present. I want to, I could take a few questions quickly if there were just some short questions. Otherwise, I'd love to turn it over to the next two speakers as quickly as possible. Yes? It's in this wonderful, detailed, several-page timeline they sent me that goes all the way back to the last glaciation, and I can't remember what it was, but it was some big threat to the basin that they formed in response to it. It might have even been a dam. I'm not sure about that though. If you email me, I will email you that thing that they sent me, which is really interesting. And I did mention to people earlier today at the round table that we have environmental history students here at the university interested in putting together this watershed movement history. And the president of the university, who's retiring and wants to write a book, is also interested in it, so we'll get it to him. So if there's yeah. Turn on the lights. Turn on some lights. And then we can switch over to, I want to introduce, I guess we'll have Joel go next. Joel Chavez is with the DEQ's Mine Remediation Bureau and is project manager for both the Silverbow Creek work and also for the main stem of the Clark Fork work that has to be done. And I sometimes, when I introduce my students to him when we go on a Silverbow Creek tour every year, I call him the fairy godfather of Silverbow Creek, and we all thank him for all he's done to bring that back. So I'm going to hand this over to him, and I'm going to help get his thing up and running.
Okay.
That'll go backwards if you need to.
Hi, thanks for the introduction, Vicki. Like she said, I'm Joel Chavez. I'm with the Department of Environmental Quality, and I manage the remediation cleanup of Silverbow Creek from Butte down to Orange Springs Ponds, which is 21.6 miles upstream. We do that in cooperation with the Natural Resource Damage Program. We spend the majority of the money, but we get significant contribution from the NRD program to do some restoration activities simultaneously with the remedial effort. So we've been doing that for several years, and when we go down to Clark Fork, the two programs will even be more integrated. So just that for background. In 1908, as I think Vicki showed, there's a lot of copper mining in Butte. Montana was a place of vast resources, and people, quite frankly, didn't really care about basically trashing out one creek. So they threw a lot of material in it. They had a bunch of tailings impoundments, and in 1908 there was a rain-on-snow event, and it broke one of the impoundments, and they all went down like dominoes. So it introduced heavy metals into Silverbow Creek, into the Clark Fork River, all the way down to here at Milltown. It was quite a mess. It killed Silverbow Creek, just plain killed it dead. Didn't do the Clark Fork River much good either. And the kind of lesson here is it doesn't take very long to make a big mess, and it takes a long time to clean it up. So here on this first one, it just shows the operable unit, basically extending from Butte down to Warm Springs. And these slides, these are some of the things we do, and you guys can read as good as I can, but it's a fully integrated process, and the first thing we have to do is go talk to the landowners, and we're on a lot of private property, but it's not too hard of a sell when you go out with these guys, and you know, the ground is green and blue. You just kind of stand there and say, it doesn't look too good, and they kind of go, no, it doesn't, and then you say, how about we clean it up for you, and they say, that'd be a wonderful idea. So we don't have it's not a hard sell with the landowners. Everybody doesn't have to have advanced degrees to understand when it looks like that there's a real problem. So they've been very good. And here's a view. This is a couple miles downstream from Butte in what's called Ramsey Flats, and everything in white is tailings. You know, 2.5 to 13 feet thick. So far to date in the project, we've moved 4.1 million cubic yards of this material out of Silverbow Creek and down to Opportunity. And here's another typical thing. You know, the groundwater table is quite close to the surface, and we have to do a lot of dewatering so we can cut the grade. So we dig a lot of holes. Put in a lot of sump pumps, and then we pump that water out and put it to these little sediment detention ponds until they clear up, and then we put it back in the creek. And here's a pretty typical shot of tailings excavation. You can see it's about 3 feet thick in this particular area. It is multicolored, to say the least, but we don't use visual observation to determine tailings is not a good way to do it. In Silverbow Creek, I would suspect at one time it was a meandering stream with a lot of beaver ponds, a lot of organic rich material, good black dirt. Unfortunately, good black dirt sucks up arsenic like a sponge. So just to say, well, it looks good, you know, there's enough arsenic that will physically kill a horse down there. So visual is not always the best thing. So we do a lot of analytical work. And what we do with our material is we are hauling them by rail down to the Opportunity Ponds, which is a former tailings impoundment for the smelter at Anaconda. It's about 5 square miles. There's over 200 million yards of material there, which ARCO has to cap and separate it from active environment. It's there, and it's not going anywhere, quite frankly. So the best thing to do was to put everything, or we thought and do think, to put all the rats in one trap. If you live in Opportunity or Anaconda, some people take exception to that notion, and so it hasn't been all you know, carefree. You know, nobody wants it in their backyard. And can't say as I blame them, but it's got to go somewhere. And the only alternative was to put tailings or repositories up and down Silverbow Creek, and that's an invitation to a long-term, expensive maintenance problem. So that's why we did what we did. Here's just a typical shot. Mornings begin by, you know, loading the train, and we have 65 cars, and we load them up every day. Well, not in the wintertime when we're shut down, but the rest of the time we load them every day and move them out every day. And one thing we have to do is this spray bar, we just wash down the tailings so we haven't got a bunch of dust blowing around. The main human health risk with this material is airborne inhalation. Now on the floodplain, everything's pretty damp, and it's not a problem. But if it sits on the loadout too long, it starts to dry out, so we just spray them down so we don't blowing them around. And here's an unload. Those are 70-ton cat trucks there, so excavator sits up above them. It was kind of a interesting system. ARCO built this and to move the Colorado tailings, and then decided they didn't want to use it, but it was there. So we just took it over, so to speak. In 2004, we crashed a train into it, so we had to do a little work on that. But accidents will happen. Here's a good shot. This is one of the things we do. We have to rebuild the stream entirely, and we use called soft engineering techniques. What we do is we build it so it can move across the floodplain naturally over time, with the exception when we are around interstate bridges, active rail lines, county bridges. When you get into those kind of things, you just get a bunch of big rock, quite frankly. But the rest of the time, we build it so it can come apart, and the material you see is a woven coconut fabric, and its life on the ground is 5 years. So it just plain goes away, and by then, we get enough vegetation established so things can start doing what they want to naturally. But the main point is wherever we can, we build it so it can start behaving as a stream should, which is to migrate across the floodplain. And here's just a shot of some water getting put into the channel. You can see we do put in point bars and riffles and things like that. And a lot of that, the money for that comes from the NRD program, because really what the remedy is supposed to do is get the site so it can come back to baseline. And what the restoration dollars do for us is to speed that up so we can get it back to baseline faster. So that's why we do these things in concert together, because it just makes sense to do it all at once. For us to come do something and then come in and tear it up and do some more would just be foolishness. And here's a shot. Sometimes the stream is pretty constrained, and I've even put the Silverbow Creek in a 36-inch pipe when I had no place to move it. That 36-inch pipe can take 70 cubic feet a second. Stream usually flows about 18. If it gets a fast thunderstorm, it can go to 400 in 15 minutes. So there's a couple sleepless nights when you do that kind of work. I think me and one contractor spent most of the fall watching the Weather Channel to make sure it didn't all blow up. We got away with it. But when we get into more wide open spaces, you can see we leave on the right is the current channel, and on the left is we're just building another channel, and then we just tie it in. And it works pretty well. We do some other things. We got to cross roads. A lot of times with our haul roads, so we're pouring concrete. We're going underneath overpasses. There's some Jersey rail getting built, and we're building bridges, which you wouldn't think you'd have to do. We're at 3 of them now, 2 railroad and 2 truck bridges, and that's, well, the railroad bridges are kind of expensive. I sent the requisition down the hall, and it was buy it from Omaha, some assembly required. It was $136,000 basically to come in a box, and you should have heard the shriek on that requisition. It was a little pricey. So here's just some portions of things when they start getting done. And here's a good one. This is where I started in September 1999. This is right outside Butte. It was not a pretty place. They used to slaughter cattle out here, and actually the ground was soft where they used to throw all the guts and stuff. It was pretty hideous place. And here's a shot when we were doing construction. And here's what it looks like now. So it's coming around pretty good, considering that there was really not very much growing there. Here's just another post shot. You're looking back towards Butte here. And this is downstream. This is a wetland that was heavily contaminated, and we couldn't get to it because it was too soft, so we waited on this one until January one year, and we were able to get it when the ground was semi-frozen. Here's another shot of this Ramsey area. One of the things that ARCO was a proponent of for years and tried to make the big sell on was some in situ liming that would take care of everything. So those are some test plots out there. They tried to sell that, but in the end, the agencies went for removal action. Here's just another shot. I mean, this is typically what Ramsey looked like. You know, nothing. You see some green stuff in grasses and things in the creek, and that's primarily because of the nitrate outfall from Butte Metro sewer. So it was green, but it's not the kind of green you really want. There's just another typical shot. Here's the guys building a stream bank. And one of the things we do, we poured a tremendous amount of material back onto the floodplain after we remove those significant depths of material, because we got to keep the grade, has to have a grade that will naturally transport sediment as a requirement. So we're always looking for borrow areas. There's really no such thing as good dirt in southwest Montana. Don't go hand in hand by any means. So whenever we find something, this is a sandy loam, we can use it, but we got to put a lot of organic material in it to get it to work. And here's just another typical construction. Even though we're pumping water all the time, you're never really out of it, but we get it down enough so we can cut to grade. And just more activity, some more stream banks. One thing we did find was the tailings covered a lot of springs in the area, and nobody knew they were there for 100 years. So when we found them, we just started building wetlands, which was, it was just a good idea. We couldn't really do much else with them anyway, and building wetlands seemed like a fine idea, because that's probably what was there before it got ruined. And here's just an aerial view of some of those wetlands we found. It just got planted about the time that shot was taken. That's Port of Montana off to the left. And this right there is just a pile of compost. We buy it we buy semi-truckloads of it, not the plastic bags at the store. We use a great deal of compost. And this is a shot down at Ramsey Flats, and what looks like the farming operation. That's the compost being incorporated into the ground there, and then it's planted. And this is an after shot. This is the Ramsey Flats area. All this was brown, blue, and green when we started, so it comes back pretty fast. And some other post-construction things. We've had a tremendous influx of wildlife that just hasn't been there, and it comes in on their own very aggressively sometimes. We were hauling borrow out of this little place, and we had a one-way loop to get the borrow, so there was kind of an island in the middle. And one spring, this fox moved in there and had like 5 babies, and we got 40-ton trucks going around here, you know, as fast as they can go because they're contractors. But and we had all these little kits would sit up on their butts and look at the truck drivers go around. And of course, the truck drivers just loved them, so everybody took it easy. But we got a lot of that thing going on. We had foxes, we got bears, we got moose, we got bighorn sheep in there. Just virtually everything. We've gone from basically very few bird species to, you know, I think 68 or 70 last year. So it's coming around really just as fast as we can go. And this is you know, guy planting trees. We plant a lot of trees. We seed a lot of grasses. It's a huge operation. We planted hundreds of thousands of trees. Butte is a high desert, and it's a tough climate, and the mortality rate can get bad. But we do not irrigate. We don't baby anything there, and they will finally establish. But the vegetation is what holds it all together. So it's not probably the most expensive part of the operation, but without it, we've just wasted our time. And we do a lot of community outreach. You notice that's not me talking to the school kids there. I'm not too good at that, but. And, you know, we do involve community in planting willows. This is where we're at right now. This is Durant Canyon. Most people don't even know it exists. It's between Butte and Fairmont, and that's where the creek goes. There's 2 active rail lines in there. It is a tight place, and it's going to be probably the most costly place we work, and we're currently in there right now. It's another shot of it. This is just this is down by Fairmont. This is all gone now, but this is what that whole place looked like, just an absolute dead zone. And there's some seating. There's some antelope there in the background. And one thing, weed control is a big deal. People really don't control very many weeds in southwest Montana, and we have an obligation to do that, but it's very, very expensive. It's also, you got to watch it close because you got to watch how much chemical you put on the ground. You're going to kill it. You just sterilize it. And I don't know what, the manufacturers say, well, you can put on so much, but they're not in the business not to sell herbicides, so we watch that pretty close. And there's just some more, these are after photos, and all those willows were about 2 inches tall when we built them, or planted them, so they're doing real well. In fact, they're over your head. So it looked, at one time, a terrible, hideous mess is coming back in a relatively short period of time. But the real message here is, it doesn't take very long to make a real big mess, and it takes a long time and a lot of money to clean it up. But it is looking good. There's just, one of the many tens of thousands of plants. And there's a composting activity in the winter. We try to do work as long as we can every year and try to get the most we can done. But the weather is the weather, and when it shuts you down, you're down. And there's some planting. To give you an idea of the costs involved here, the remedy part of the settlement was $87 million in associated interest. We spent $70 million, and we're going to spend $35 million more. So I imagine Silverbow Creek is going to come in at 105, and that's the remedies end of it. NRD will probably have 15 or 20 into it on top of that. So it's pretty pricey work. We had some good investments. We're going to come in under, we'll have $30 or $50 million left over on this job, and the leftover money goes back to the Natural Resource Damage Program so it could get used in the basin for more cleanup. So that's really good to do that. We've never cut a corner on Silverbow Creek. I will never cut a corner, but we manage our operations. We don't waste money. We spend it when we have to, and we don't hold back. But if you run these things and pay attention, you can generate some savings and put it to work back in the basin. So that's, we think, pretty positive. Yeah, guys get tired. We do a lot of monitoring, about $300,000 a year worth. It's required. And we do lots of different kinds of monitoring. The fish monitoring, that wasn't required. And we were talking today, about what a good thing that's been for us to do that. And somebody said, gee, Joel, that was a good idea. And I said, well, it wasn't my idea, and I had to get nagged into it because I didn't want to do it. In fact, there's some people in this room that did some of the nagging, but in the end, it was a good idea. And so no regrets. And there's a picture that Vicki showed. That was in 2008, and I was getting nagged on, now we got to do this, and finally I just said, fine, do it, and so I'm home at noon. I called, okay, now what'd you get this year? Some more suckers? What? No, we got a West Slope cutthroat up by Ramsey. Wasn't quite ready for that. Oh, and this is just showing it as we've got a reduction in what's going on, and the important line is remediated, non-remediated. You can see it makes a pretty instant difference when we do our work. There's just another one. So it's getting better. And there's a western bee plant. Oh, and here's a slide I stole from Trevor at FWPU, who is here, but it just shows total species sampled, and things are slowly looking up. I wouldn't call it a fishery by any means, but there just wasn't anything in there for about 100 years, so it does make a difference. Oh, here's the, I'm going to read you all these. These are the amount of, these are the bird species that have come in, and that's, like I said earlier, that's been a dramatic increase since we started in the fall of 1999. Lots of ducks. There's another one of Trevor's slides, just showing that, you know, we're finding some stuff now, and it just wasn't there. So that's what I got. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be happy to give it a whirl. Okay, yeah, go ahead. What's that?
What's the compost? Where does it come from?
Mostly the flathead. Glacier Gold has been a big supplier for us for a long time.
Mostly like wood waste?
Yeah. Yeah, we don't like manure because it's got weed seeds in it. So we stay out of it. So, yeah.
Any large weed debris in some of the streams?
Yeah, we put some in, and, you know, it didn't turn out too good. You know, people wanted to raft, you know, they'd be getting hit on the head with these logs and stuff like that. So we've really stayed away from it. We talked about it a lot, and we tried it some, but we just didn't carry on with it. So. Yeah, it wasn't big. I don't think it was big timber. Unfortunately, we have to kind of guess on that. Who knows? Yeah, go ahead. They're already moved in, which is kind of the bane of my life. I want them in there, but I don't want them in there quite yet till those trees grow up because they'll just, you know, they ravage them overnight. But yeah, they're in. Yeah.
How long do you have to monitor areas that you've restored?
We'll be at least 20 years. It's a long-term commitment. It's in the record of decision. That's what you got to do. So, okay.
We have another exciting story, and that's the Milltown story. And we have Diana Hammer from the EPA here. She's the fairy godmother of Milltown, along with a lot of others. And she is the project manager for the Milltown remediation part.
I'm really happy to be here talking about the Milltown project. I'm the new project manager for Milltown. Many of you who've been involved with this probably remember Russ Forba, and he deserves a ton of credit for this project being where it is today. So he retired last year, and then I took over. Okay, there we go. So this is, like I mentioned, a lot of the credit goes to Russ, but there were so many other people who were involved in this project. The remediation was led by EPA along working very closely with DEQ from the state of Montana, but many other players from the state of Montana were also involved. The Natural Resource Damage Program, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, for the bridge work, Montana Department of Transportation. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was involved because we had endangered species on the site, bald eagle and the bull trout. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been overseeing the construction. Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have traditional treaty rights at the confluence of the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork rivers. I think in Salish it's called the place of the big bull trout. Missoula County has been huge supporter of this project and invaluable. City of Missoula and the residents of the Milltown Bonner area have played also an important role. The Milltown Redevelopment Working Group started in 2003 and really created a vision for what the site could become afterwards. The Clark Fork River Technical Assistance Committee, it's a community group working in the lower and upper river, and they've done a tremendous job with outreach. And if you look on the table out front, there's a really good handout that has some really amazing graphics about the river restoration that's going on in the area. The Clark Fork Coalition, along with maybe some of you in the audience, has been working for decades to see the Milltown Dam removed. So there's a lot of people who put tons of effort into this. Friends of Two Rivers is a community group formed, like Vicki mentioned recently, in the Bonner Milltown area of mainly Milltown and Bonner West Riverside residents, specifically working on initially on the Milltown project. Trout Unlimited has been very supportive, and then Atlantic Richfield and Northwestern Energy have funded the cleanup. Joel mentioned that he would spend about $105 million, and that's probably about what we'll spend on remediation. And then Envirocon has done the construction, and then the members of the public have been just so supportive of this project. We had 15,000 public comments come in during the public comment period, so a lot of interest in this project. And then as with any project that goes on for a long time, sometimes during the course of the project you lose some really key players. And I just wanted to mention there's a few that have passed during the time, and just wanted to recognize their contributions. Phil Taranjo was a longtime natural resources advisor with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. John Wardell, my former boss, directed the Montana EPA office for 25 years. He died last summer. And then Len Chambel, many of you know, a longtime river advocate. So here we are. As you all know, Vicki spent a lot of time talking about the state of the basin. The Milltown operable unit is really half of a larger Superfund site, which includes the Clark Fork River, which stretches nearly from Butte all the way down to the Milltown Reservoir. And so I am going to go through sort of the last century in pictures. This is the historic confluence drawing. The Milltown Dam was, construction began in 1905, took a couple of years, literally with horsepower and hand saws, and it was completed in January of 1908. And as Joel mentioned, back in the early 1900s, people weren't that careful with what they did with mine waste. And in 1908, perhaps a 500-year flood came downstream and washed a lot of that, those mine wastes placed alongside the stream downstream, contaminating the Clark Fork River. Joel mentioned what it did to Silverbow Creek, and then depositing a lot of it behind the Milltown Reservoir. And those sediments contained arsenic, which is a carcinogen, threat to public health, and it also contained copper. It contained other metals as well, but those were the two primary ones we were concerned about. Copper, because even in minute quantities, it's toxic to fish. So this is a picture of the 1908 flood. Nearly took out the dam. It was only 5 months old, and it almost destroyed it. So the dam had to be rebuilt. This is a picture from about 1935. You can see the Milltown Dam right here at the bottom, the Blackfoot River coming in, and the Clark Fork. And this is a picture of the Milltown powerhouse and dam as it looked for much of the 20th century. And over that century, the arsenic in the sediments, there was no oxygen present as an anoxic environment, and the arsenic moved down through the sediments and eventually worked its way into the drinking water supply in Milltown. Picture of the powerhouse. And in 1981, someone with the Missoula County Health Department was out taking water samples and noticed that there were really high levels of arsenic in the drinking water wells in Missoula or in Milltown. And there was a new law that had just been passed the year before, the Superfund law, and the levels were high enough that it got federal attention, and the Milltown site was the first Superfund site listed in Montana. It was listed in 1984, or 83, I'm sorry. And it was listed largely because of the arsenic contamination, this arsenic plume right here around Milltown. The residents were over here with their drinking water supply, but the arsenic stretched, actually went this way, but it was also underlying the Milltown Reservoir. And so this is the community, which you're probably familiar with. And I just want to make sure that some of you may be newer to the project. We did after years and years of study, looking at different alternatives, in 2004, after a lot of public comment and all those studies, we did come up with a record of decision. It was signed in December of 2004, and it called for removal of the Milltown Dam and the most highly contaminated sediments. There's about 6.6 million cubic yards of sediments in the Milltown Reservoir, and we removed about a third of them, but in that third represented about 80 to 90% of the pollution. And our goal was one of our main goals was to restore the drinking water supply. So by removing those highly contaminated sediments, we could restore the drinking water supply. And our estimates are in 4 to 10 years. So maybe by 2019, the drinking water supply should be cleaned up. We also wanted to protect the fishery and provide fish passage, which would happen once we remove the barrier, the Milltown Dam. And like Joel mentioned, he was talking about the integration of remediation and restoration on Silverbow Creek. This project is also a story of integration and collaboration between remediation, restoration, and then the third element in this case is redevelopment. And that effort has been led by Missoula County working with the Milltown Redevelopment Working Group, and now a key player is Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So now it's about kind of a month-by-month shot here of the Milltown site as it transforms. So June 2006 was the first permanent drawdown of the reservoir. We lowered the reservoir water level 12 feet. And we lowered it in June. As Vicki showed, the water temperatures in 2006 were really high, and we were doing, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was saying the effects of the drawdown on caged fish below the dam, and we started to see a lot of fish die off. So we raised the water level back up until September when the water temperatures dropped. And for those of you who know a lot about fish, you know that fish are much more tolerant of adverse conditions when the water temperatures are cooler. So we raised the water level up, helped the fish out a little bit through August, and then we're able to permanently draw down the reservoir in September. Here's the dam and the powerhouse during that drawdown in June. And September, here's an aerial photo. Oh, I should mention a lot of these aerial photos are taken by Gary Matson and his wife Judy, or with Mike Custudia, our local pilot photographer. Then in March 2007 was really our year of infrastructure construction. We spent the whole year building haul roads and building flood berms to protect the sediments from getting washed downstream. There's a flood berm protecting these are the most highly contaminated sediments here. It's called Sediment Accumulation Area 1. And we built flood berm here to protect those sediments from the Clark Fork, and over here a flood berm to protect the sediments from the flows of the Blackfoot, because the last thing we wanted to do was wash those sediments downstream. Here's a shot in April, more advances on the flood berm construction. And in May, you can see there's beginning of some excavation on site, more work on this flood berm. In June, another aerial photo, compliments of Gary Matson. And here you can see the floodplain, and you can see the excavation cells where we're going to start excavating, or where we're starting to excavate the contaminated sediments. And then July, and so here you can see the Blackfoot River flood berm is constructed, the Clark Fork one's in place, more sediment excavation. In August, more sediment excavation. There's kind of a recurring theme here. And in September, you can really start to begin to see the beginnings of the bypass channel. And the bypass channel was designed to divert the Clark Fork River, provide a clean place for the Clark Fork River to flow to reduce the amount of sediment that would be transported downstream when we breached the dam. And it was a really key best management practice, and it reduced the amount of sediment, I think, by about 60%. So it was expensive, but in our opinion, it was very well worth it. And there's October, and you can see that we've constructed a rail line here, and on October 2nd, 2007, we filled that train up for the first time, 45 cars, 100 tons per car, and every day, spring, summer, winter, fall, and winter, we sent that train off-site to the Anaconda Smelter Superfund site, where they would use the material, the excavated sediments to help establish a vegetative cap on the Opportunity Ponds waste repository. And the shot of the loading the trains. So there's a lot, you'll see a lot more of excavate, load, and haul through the next slides. December, photographing the site during the winter is always kind of a challenge. It's hard to see. And this is kind of a last shot of the powerhouse. In order to, this is an integrated project with restoration. In order to really restore the rivers, we couldn't leave the powerhouse in place. In order to have a naturally functioning river system, you can't have a big structure like the powerhouses, no matter how historic the powerhouse was. And there was a lot of people who really wanted to save it, but since we couldn't save it, we did the next best thing. The Milltown Redevelopment Working Group worked with some local contractors who worked pro bono to salvage some of the windows of the powerhouse, the old door, a generator, staircase, the control panel, which was made of marble, which is kind of cool, and a lot of other historic items from the powerhouse. And we feel pretty fortunate to have been able to do that. We also, another kind of a now historic sign, you would no longer need the portage. And then in January 2008, the powerhouse came down. It was a 3-sided brick structure, came down really quickly. And the bricks, we had hoped to save a lot of the bricks, but they didn't hold up very well during the demolition. And then in this picture, a month later, you can see the powerhouse is completely gone. The generators are gone, leaving the penstocks where the water would come in flowing through the powerhouse, turn the generators to generate the electricity, and we were, like I said, we were able to save one of those generators. And the other generators were actually sold. They were 1905 GE generators, and they were sold, and I believe they were planned to still be used. So they were pretty sturdy workhorses. Picture of the site in February 2008. And then in March 2008, you can see the powerhouse and the right abutment are gone from the site. And we are preparing to breach the dam through the powerhouse. But before we can do that, we need to divert the Clark Fork River into the bypass channel. And so here's the bypass channel. It's constructed, all complete. It's lined with what were called Reno mattresses. They were basically rock-filled wire cages that lined the bypass channel to provide a clean environment for the river to flow through. And then in order to fill the bypass channel, it seems a little counterintuitive maybe, but we first opened the outlet of the bypass channel and slowly allowed the Blackfoot River to fill the bypass channel. And we had to do this very carefully. We worked with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to make sure that we didn't dewater the river too much, because we didn't want too much water flowing into the bypass channel to decrease the amount of water available in the Clark Fork downstream. And then after that we did that, then we opened the inlet. So this is upstream of the site, and this is the inlet. This is the diversion dike keeping the Clark Fork over here, and the Clark Fork began to flow into the bypass channel. And here you can see the water slowly working its way through. And again, here's the bypass channel filling up. And these, we worked again with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to put in some rock structures to aid in fish passage in the bypass channel, because it had a pretty smooth bottom, and we wanted to make it easier for fish. It took about 18 hours to fill the bypass channel. And then the big day, March 28th, 2008, we had hundreds and hundreds of people watching on the Milltown Bluff. Many of you may have been there or watched, watching on we had a webcam there, compliments of the Clark Fork Coalition, and another photo by Gary Matson. And this was the first time in 100 years where the Clark Fork River and the Blackfoot Rivers had flowed freely through the dam. And like Vicki mentioned, just a month later, we had a fish, actually, the first documented fish traveling upstream through the breached dam. And then this, that same month, April, this is looking at kind of an odd shot, because it's looking at the back of the Milltown spillway with no water in the reservoir. And then in May, you can see the The river is flowing through where the powerhouse was here. The river's flowing through, and over here behind the spillway, it's a dry area where we can now work. And like Joel mentioned, it's a lot easier working when it's dry. Shot of the whole site. We continue to excavate, load, and haul the sediments off-site by rail. Same thing in June, more excavate, load, and haul. And same thing in July, excavate, load, and haul. And picture of the site in August. In September, more excavation, loading, and hauling. And right now, in this shot, we're focusing on removing what we called some of the triangle area sediments. Here's a shot from the Milltown Bluff, where you can see the spillway is all gone. This is the divider block which separated the powerhouse and the dam. It's still there, and they're working to remove the last bits of the spillway. More excavation. More excavation. In January 2009, getting closer to being we're preparing to breach the spillway cofferdam. And there's a divider block with nothing left of the spillway anymore. And some restoration program was putting in some grade control structure right upstream. And then in March, preparing to breach. And here we'd removed a lot of the material here, so this would be easy to draw the river over here closer to the Milltown Bluff over on River Left. And here's an aerial photo of that happening. There's an excavator here opening up this channel to draw the river in. There's the river coming in, flowing, trying to draw the Clark Fork, combined flows of the Clark Fork and Blackfoot over here below at the base of the Milltown Dam. And here's a picture of the next month, and you can see that the river, we've captured maybe about half of the river over in the new channel and half in the old powerhouse, in the powerhouse channel. And then in May 2009, almost just a little less than a year ago, we had excavated nearly so much of the sediments that the majority of sediments that remained to be excavated actually were underneath the rail line. So we started pulling out the rail line, backing the train track out, and excavating the material out behind it. In June, we continued to excavate underneath the rail line and shorten the track. And after spring flow last year, if you remember, it was a pretty good flow year, and we ended up with a big pile of alluvium brought by Mother Nature, 6-7 feet deep, and it just sort of naturally formed there. So I think Chris Brick said this a while ago, that one of the big themes here is just a lot of change on this river, and that's the thing that we're going to be seeing a lot of, and see what happens as the river seeks its equilibrium. July 2009, it's a shot looking upstream, Milltown Bluff there, looking upstream. Here's some of the sediment or alluvium that accumulated with some stockpiled material. Shot from August, this past August. And you can see that these contaminated sediments have been excavated. We're starting to see the stumps. It was really pretty cool. As we excavated down to remove the contamination, we knew we were at the original floodplain because we started to see the stumps from the trees that were cut down when the dam was built. So that was pretty cool. In addition to any sort of sampling confirmation we might have wanted to have, we were able to see the stumps. And we also, another really cool thing, some vegetation just naturally sprouted, and botanists think that those may have been seeds that were buried when the dam was first flooded and have lain dormant for a century and are now resprouting. So that's pretty exciting too. And on September 24th, that was the day of the last trainload of sediment leaving the site. So it took us just under 2 years to move 3 million tons of sediment. And our estimation was that if we hadn't intervened with excavators and bulldozers and heavy equipment, it would have taken nature between 200 and 2,000 years. So we speeded up the process slightly. And then with that, with the end of the remediation excavation, sediment excavation and hauling offsite. The focus really now has been shifting more and more to restoration. And these slides were provided by Doug Martin with the Natural Resource Damage Program. He's leading that phase of the project, and on behalf of the other site trustees, the Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. So I'm going to show you a few pictures of the restoration going on at the site. This is the grading plan, sort of a little cartoon of a grading plan with the river. This is upstream, moving down to the confluence with the Blackfoot, and you can see the different colors for different kinds of high terraces, low terraces, some wetlands, side channels coming in. And the goal of the restoration program is really to create as naturally a functioning river system and floodplain as possible, using as much native vegetation as possible. And I'll show you some of the techniques they're using. They did try to salvage as much native material growing on site as possible. Willows, we salvaged a lot of willows. And then this is work actually done in the project area. If you drive by I-90 and just, especially if you're a passenger, you can take a good look. You can see the beginnings of the Clark Fork River channel being cut, and these are wetlands that have been planted. They were planted in the fall, and then there's a healthy deer population in the area, so they've put up protective fencing. And then most of the work this last year was upstream of the old Duck Bridge, if you remember where that was. So they're focusing on the river work upstream. Heavy equipment, they need to use some heavy equipment at times. Here's an aerial shot showing some of the work further upstream. And unlike further upstream along Silverbow Creek, there are, you can see that there are more, some bigger trees, some big cottonwoods, and woody debris down in this stretch of the river makes some sense. And so the Natural Resource Damage Program has worked with some contractors to develop a bank stabilization program using that coconut matting that Joel talked about, along with plantings of willows and then some interlaced pretty good-sized logs too. And the goal here is for the first 15 years, they really want to provide some pretty solid stabilization for the bank, because they're investing all this time and money trying to recreate a naturally functioning river and floodplain system, but at the same time, they don't want it to all blow out in the first big flow. So it's kind of a balance between heavier-handed approach, yet trying to let the river establish. And put some rock structures in, and some energy dissipators to help the river function more naturally. Another bank stabilization photo. More bank stabilization work here. And then I've got a couple of aerial shots, just giving you a perspective from the air, what the restoration looks like upstream. And so the first part of the project was remediation, the first R. The second part was restoration, the second R. And the third R is redevelopment. And our hope is that we can turn this Superfund site, it's kind of a rare opportunity when you can take a hazardous waste site and actually turn it into something as beneficial as a state park. And so the Milltown Redevelopment Working Group has been working since 2003, a lot of public input on different designs, including a design workshop. And this is the current, it's still conceptual, it's the current plan. 3 areas. This is the Milltown Gateway along the Blackfoot, the confluence area, and then this is the former reservoir area. And the idea is that this area would be a little more developed with some picnic tables and trails and some interpretive signage. This area would also have some interpretive signage and trails, but the former reservoir would be kept as natural as possible. It's in a floodplain, and there'll be wetlands, probably some good birding and other wildlife viewing opportunities, but the idea is to keep that pretty natural. And then these are some artist renditions of what the area might look in a few decades. So thank you very much. It's always kind of a pleasure to describe this project. It's been a fun one to work on, but it wouldn't have been possible without the contributions of so many people, and all the people who supplied photographs. Thank you.
Okay, so we've seen some of what has been accomplished over the past 20 years, and really it's nothing short of amazing. You know, 25 years ago on Silverbow Creek and at Milltown, the decision had just been, you know, made to call these Superfund sites, and that was really the very beginning. So those of us, you know, thinking about the next 20 years, 25 years, those of us who study the river can probably make some predictions, but we would couch those predictions in kind of esoteric terms of loads and concentrations, and we'd be talking about copper and arsenic and benthic macroinvertebrates, and we'd be spewing a lot of acronyms. But really, you know, we can only guess. We heard earlier that over $1 million will be spent in the Clark Fork on Superfund cleanup and restoration, but really that's only part of the story. Earlier today, Brian McDonald of the Blackfoot Challenge was asked why they've been so successful with this drought management plan on the Blackfoot. And this is, you know, where ranchers voluntarily give up some of their water during dry periods so that it can stay in stream, so some flow can stay in the river. And, you know, someone asked, well, you know, how do you get that to work? I mean, and why have you been able to do this? Why has it been successful? And he thought about it for a while and said, well, really, it's been the people. It all boils down to the people in the basin. And I think that's important to remember, because if we're successful in continuing this restoration saga, it will be because people in communities in the basin value it and commit to it. And if you're here, chances are you are some of those people, so thank you. And that is also why I am pleased to introduce Rick Bass, our next speaker. The critics like to categorize writers, and Rick is sometimes called a nature writer, and I think he is, but that doesn't quite cover it completely. It's true that he writes about nature, but he also writes about the nature of the human heart. Rick is the son of a geologist, and he became a geologist himself. He worked as a petroleum geologist, in fact, looking for oil for about 8 years in the South and Southwest. But then he started writing, and that must be what he was meant to do, because he was writing on lunch hours and during breaks and during his free time. Eventually, that's what he began doing full-time, and in fact, he is an award-winning and very prolific author. He's got numerous collections of short stories, a couple novels, and he's also written a lot of nonfiction. 24 published works was the number I heard recently, but I'm not sure it's easy to count. He lives in the Yak, where he's been for the last 20-some years. We're fortunate now to have him in the Clark Fork Basin, at least part-time, while his daughters are in school. And so that is why we invited him here, to help us envision, I think, what things might look like 25 years from now. So, Rick.
Thank you, Chris. Can y'all hear me in the back? Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me in. That's mind-boggling and beautiful, the presentations. Thanks, Vicki, for the big overview, and Joel and Diana. That's, you know, really incredible. That should be every kid's textbook. I mean, they should be showing that slide program in the schools. That's the story of this community and where we live. It's amazing. When y'all asked me to come talk, you know, I'm from the Yak country, and I don't know anything about this country. And I asked my friend Tracy, I said, well, why do they want me there? What do I talk about? And she thought for a minute, and she thought, well, that you know about injury, and talk about injury, because that's all we know here. And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Those slides and those talks were so profound. I mean, it looked so much like surgery. It looked like, you know, veins and shunts and stents and you know, truncations and amputations and just, you know, it was profound. It was really, really very surgical and but wonderful. And I'm really amazed by what you guys are doing. It also looked mythic. It looked like you know, like you'd read in some old history book, oh, this is where the Aztecs and the Incas worked and lived. And you know, anthropologists would be looking at it and saying, well, I wonder what they did there. And, you know, not knowing anything, we'd say, oh, they went there to pray. You know, it was their special place. they look at our place, we're not going there to pray. We're asking there to, ask forgiveness and make, maybe kind of close to praying, but not quite. It's pretty profound slide, so thanks for putting those together. I'm not a river person. I prefer to be up in the mountains, back in the forest that lead right up to the highest edges of the mountains, with their bright basins of sunlight and wildflowers and too much sky. I like the tactile, graspable here and now of the forest, the soft Kootenai soil beneath my feet, far more than the always going away blue-silver ungraspability of water or the nothingness of sky. I do like to look down at rivers from far above and to see the shining elegance of each, like one silver sentence, with which they pass through the cleave of the mountains and the velvet forest they nurture and which nurtures them. Where I come from, in the rainforest of the Yak, both sides of the river are usually heavily timbered. There is not so often the dark and light, dry and wet, yin and yang cycle of north slope, south slope, grassland and conifer. Where I come from, there's water everywhere, but it is back in the dark forest where much of the business of living occurs. We depend on the rivers for our lives, but I am wary of committing to them. I like being able to come and go. I think it's interesting how the most mercurial thing, the river, the thing that is always in quick motion, is in some ways the most predictable and dependable, able to shoulder the burden of slow and tentative non-committal by all others. My heart is in the Kootenai watershed, the Clark Fork's cousin, where, as with the Clark Fork, there have been crimes of harm and greed, with the lesser crimes of inattention filling the interstices like silt between gravel. You can climb to the tops of the high peaks in my drainage and peer down into the Clark Fork. There are ridges, many continental divides, where our two watersheds will squabble over the same drop of water, the same flake of snow, and being on the north slope, we usually get it. Something else we got up in the Kootenai was the W.R. Grace Company, where in the lower Yak, the top of a mountain, vermiculite mountain, was sawed off. Asbestos mining began there in 1923 and proceeded until 1990, when the passage of the Clean Air Act finally made that mining not only a moral crime, but finally a legal crime. Before it was over, however, an estimated 15 billion pounds of ore was driven down off the one mountain and into town, loaded into boxcars and shipped east and west, with ribbons of toxic squirrel attending the train's passages day after day, year after year, and in town after town, with the rail lines following the routes of rivers. Much in the news is Lincoln County's 30-fold epidemic of asbestosis and mesothelioma, the former a disease of scar-bound, gritty incrustation of the lungs that robs air and ultimately life, and the latter an incurable 6-week wildfire of a cancer. Less reported is Spokane's outbreak of multiple sclerosis, the highest in the nation, maybe the world. Spokane is where the Libby ore was poured into sacks for marketing. And less reported, too, is the prevalence of the strange and debilitating autoimmune disorders in Lincoln County that are MS-like: lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, scleroderma, fibromyalgia. The asbestos fibers are incredibly tiny, which is why they're so deadly. They pierce and perforate and scratch the pleura of the lungs and stomach. Downstream of the old Milltown Dam, and what do you call that site now that the dam is gone? The place where the wound was, but where soon there will not even be a scar? Here in the Garden City, where there is so much hope, I find that I'm better able to reflect on the nature of scars and crimes and to rest for a while. The Clark Fork has been good to me. Poets write about still water lakes beside which are perched small cabins with their yellow square window light reflecting on the night waters, loon trill carrying for miles across those quiet waters, the scent of pines and the hooting of owls, all that sleepy stuff. Those fortunate enough to live by running water know how lucky those of the Clark Fork are to live by a slightly livelier pace, to have our lungs and brains stimulated, energized by the motion and annual cycles of a wild river. Any vision of the 21st century in the Clark Fork or its surrounding watersheds must include a template, a plan for addressing our scars. That's not whining. On the contrary, it's courageous. Something important happened a long time ago in the Yak, 20 years ago, which, in white folks' time, represents about 1/6 of all the time that ever was. 1/6 of history with a capital H. It's a ludicrous consideration, hubris with a capital H, and yet it's also one of our realities. We haven't been here for very long, and in that short time we've been able to do tremendous damage. It is not impossible, then, to imagine that in those same segments of human time, 20, 40, 60-year whacks, we can also accomplish some significant forward movement, some reclamation. 20 years ago, a wild-eyed hippie do-gooder, social justice kid, Scott Daly, came to the Yak Valley from Pennsylvania. Just a kid, a 20-something, with his girlfriend, looking for adventure. He immediately fell in love with the landscape and began dreaming a magnificent vision in the Yak. It wasn't just enough to protect the last wild country up there and to stitch together, to reconnect the in-between terrestrial places. The culture of wildness and of ecological health needed to be retold and celebrated up there, he realized, preserved where it was present and retold where such a story was lacking or had gone awry. Such work could take decades, he said, but he is such an idealist. He said that every journey begins with but a single step. Such reformation wouldn't just be artsy-fartsy cultural and storytelling, he said, but needed to be demonstrated in on-the-ground projects, too. He went straight to the heart of the most damaged watershed in the Upper Yak, the one nobody could possibly argue had not been overcut. And slowly, year by year, he set about replacing blown-out culverts, surveying streams, securing funding for fisheries biologists, employing local workers. He and Robin King, the director of a local conservation group, the Yak Valley Forest Council, created a nonprofit restoration company, Headwaters Restoration Partnership Project, and took on the task not of moving mountains, but of putting them back together. I've always been extraordinarily impressed by those visionaries who possess an intensity of focus, what we sometimes call obsession, but which is really maybe only an extreme acuity of the senses. And I have an even more special place in my heart for those visionaries who can dream 2 or more dreams at once, like Scott, who typically has half a dozen or more percolating, intense, major dreams. Perhaps such creative response is the natural outgrowth from a land of such extraordinary biodiversity and such a duality of existence, situated as the Yak is between the firescape of the northern Rockies and the fungal, swampy rot of the Pacific Northwest. Scott writes grants for our little group now and runs a native plant nursery and restoration company in the Clark Fork watershed in the downstream port of Sandpoint, where he's also currently trying to restore his young body from a strange and aggressive bone cancer. The docs keep cutting parts of him out, organs, bones. There's a troubling spot on his lungs that grows, then shrinks. But he's pushing on, he's looking for a cure, and he's looking for a story. Thus far, Robin and Scott have strained like great baleen whales swimming through the not-so-vast sea of private funders over $1 million out there for the Upper Yak. A far cry from the $500 million that's rebuilding the Clark Fork, but it's similar work and the best work, making something sick better, being proud of our scars and responsible for their rehabilitation is not a particularly dramatic vision, but it's the vision we need now throughout the West, coupled with one more push to protect those last few crumbs of roadless public lands we have not yet despoiled. The lockbox, the jewels, the treasure. Scott in Sandpoint is growing willows and alder, repairing the thousands of miles of old logging roads that circle some mountains in the Yak like the scars of surgery. The tracks of the roads acting like glistening though artificial rivers each spring, carrying water out of the valley and out of the forest rather than leaving it where it needs to stay. When we are lucky, our work becomes our lives. I keep meaning to talk about the Clark Fork instead of the Kootenai. The Clark Fork has been good to me. I bought a float tube so that I can glide down its cold waters with my wife and daughters. Sometimes in the midst of my relaxation, my healing, I wonder, is the water safe to touch? Is the air safe to breathe? Is this how tame I have become for such thoughts, the baseline of our existence, eating and breathing, to be so conscious in my life, rather than busying myself with the loftier and more evolved goals of considering spirit and spirituality? That which Joyce called the challenge to forge in the smithy of my soul a new consciousness of my race. I love how the Clark Fork looks at night. I love the North Bank and the South Bank. I wouldn't mind seeing some more cobble or brick streets downtown with floral and tribal designs intricately inlaid in places containing secret and important messages that can be seen best from afar. The cobble roads would slow things down a bit and would glisten in the spring rain. But beyond that, I don't really have a vision. Sometimes I almost feel satisfied, which is an unfamiliar sensation indeed. I love the energy of the river, even if I do not love the river itself. Every time I'm near it, it humbles me, pulls somehow at the threads in me that tell me I'm becoming a slacker, that I'm growing benumbed to the world, a creature of routines, which is not the same thing as a creature of rhythms and cycles. It's awfully easy here in the Great Recession to work harder, grumble louder, to reel through the days stewing in a constant low-level simmer of angst and despair. It's easy, even in the presence of a bright river and surrounded by sharp, steep mountains, to say tomorrow, to recall old times spent in the mountains and to dream of future trips, but to procrastinate and instead push on, grind on, just working. Sometimes it almost seems that walking across the river and catching a whiff of spring cottonwoods or looking up at the mountains and remembering is enough in a slackwater kind of way, or is at least better than nothing. I think such an assertion is even defensible, though I don't believe it in my heart. Everybody is guilty of something. In my mind, the W.R. Grace defenders were guilty of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, mayhem, manslaughter, the whole corporate litany. But every day, walking or driving or riding back and forth across the river, I'm guilty of my own kind of taking away, of letting unexplored forests slip through my fingers, hikes not taken, hunts not made. It's one of the great lulling beauties of life, letting days without action slip past, and yet, if too much slips past, we become complicit in the daily little deaths we inflict upon what Mary Oliver has called our one wild and precious life. Richard Hugo was born the same year the first mining road was built up onto Vermiculite Mountain, the year the first bulldozer blade cut earth, but he knew the story even before it began. In his poem, The Towns We Know and Leave Behind, the Rivers We Carry With Us, dedicated to the Ohio poet James Wright, Hugo says, I forget the names of towns without rivers. A town needs a river to forgive the town. Whatever river, whatever town, it is much the same. The cruel things I did, I took to the river. I begged the current, make me better. Your town, your river, or mine, it is much the same. A murdering man lives on the land, in a shack the river birds hate. He rubs the red shriek of night from his eyes. He prays to water, don't let me do that again. Let's name your river, Ohio. Let's name all rivers, one in the blood, red stream and debris in the blood. Say George Doty had a wrong head. Say that Ohio forgives what George did, and the river birds loved his shack. Let's name the birds, heron and sweat. Let's get away from the mud. The river is there to forgive the town, and without a river, a town abuses the sky. The river is there to forgive what I did. Let's name my river, Duwamish. And let's admit the river birds don't hate my home. That's a recent development, really, like mercury in the cod. Without a river, a town abuses the air. The river is there to forgive what I did. The river birds hate what I did until I name them. Your river or mine, it is much the same. A murdering man lived on the bank. Here's the trick. We had to stay drunk to welcome the river, to live in a shack, to die on the bank, beneath the bigoted sky, under the river birds, day after day, to murder away all water that might die. A murdering man is dead on the bank of your new river, the East, on mine, the Clark Fork. It is much the same. Your river has gulls and tugs, mine has eagles in sky. I rubbed last night from my eyes. I asked bright water, what's happened? The river, I'm not sure which one, says water has no special power. What should I do, or you? Now water has no need to forgive. What shall become of murder? How shall we live when we killed, when we died by the word? Whatever the name of the river, we both had two women to love, one to love us enough we left behind a town that abuses the day, the other to love the river we brought with us, the shack we lived and still live in, the birds, the towns that return to us for names, and we give them names, knowing the river murders them away. Maybe my vision for the Clark Fork has less to do with aquatic and terrestrial monitoring and more to do with the people who are briefly connected to it and the development, the restoration of people's relationship to it. That at the end of our run, we each be able to say we lived a purposeful and, what word to use, satisfactory life. We will never become gods, nor should we, but at least we can become more human. And bringing back a thing that has gone away, a precious thing, is as powerful a penance as I can imagine. If you believe that a god or gods created something, and then we took it away, the least we can do is try to bring it back. I don't get or like fish or fishing. It looks suspiciously like golf, except you can't see what's going on beneath the surface. You're wishing, striving after something you usually can't see, and with what seems to me an extreme degree of separation in the medium. You up on land, your prey underwater. Maybe it's like playing golf from a hang glider. It's loud, too, along a river. You can't hear your enemies sneaking up behind you. In the yak, we are always aware of where our enemies are. We are the first to hear, to feel, the distant throb of those darkened helicopters. I just don't like rivers, really. I like the woods. It makes sense to me that the animals in the woods come down to the river for a brief drink and then turn and go back into the woods. I took kayaking classes here in town, but I like the float tubes better. My frayed and throbbing rotator cuffs have the elasticity of last hunting season's styrofoam coffee cup floating around on the floorboard of a 1980 F-150. I like the rubber duck quality of the float tubes, the connection to childhood. I think it's really cool that there is fast water for folks who like it and fish for people who like to harass fish. If you're lucky, you learn eventually that there are places that are not such a good fit for you, and you accommodate your paths to reflect that time-crafted negotiation rather than seeking with your one brief life to wear down and sand and polish the world to your fit. I don't know why I'm so lulled by the Clark Fork. I'm not a stranger to worry. I can stand on the bridge in town and look down at the lush springtime clamor, can feel the river shudder against the pylons below, and yet envision a globally warmed future in which below me lies the pale skeletal dry bed of where water flows no more. A cobbled arroyo in which W.R. Grace executives with dyed mohawks and giant safety pins in their cheeks rollerblade each day, machetes in hand and the day's scalps swinging from their belts. Tent cities pitched in the center of where the river was, and town a smoldering ruin. I worry that Congress will not be able to overturn the Supreme Court's decision about corporations' freedom of speech, speech somehow being interpreted as the ability to pour money into political campaigns. If I take a rocket launcher and start lobbing rounds at the Grace Tower in New York, is that not likewise a form of expression of so-called speech? I worry about the Tea Party and its stupid, ignorant, self-pitying violence against a democracy they claim to support. I worry about hate. I worry that Scott, fixer of Little Rivers, won't get well. I worry that he won't get all he wanted out of this life. I worry that my editor will get fired if I don't write a bestseller. I worry that Scotty's Table will take the Chapino off its menu. The woman who replaced Scott, Robin, was beset by a mysterious illness, a meningioma, a soft tissue growth between her brain and skull. Was it a result of absorbing those countless microscopic, nanoscopic asbestos fibers? Nobody knows. She had the top of her skull cut off. The growth was scooped out, the skull sewn back on, and now she is well again. A new study came out last month about venous tangles in the brain, the nervous system's central command, possibly becoming blocked by the penetrations of tiny shunts, such as asbestos fibers, which then sets off an autoimmune response. I don't know. My area of expertise is in representing the sounds and names and colors and textures of things, not in understanding them. But still, I can't help but wonder. With regard to story and the elements we put into a painting or a tale, or for that matter, history, with our actions as well as inactions, I am particularly attentive to stories of Vermiculite Mountain with its top sawed off, or of the richest hill in Butte, and of these attempts to reclaim that which we so quickly and greedily and youthfully tore apart. As a storyteller, I'm interested in using the same boundaries and directives and templates of how something was taken away to then reclaim that which was taken. It is admittedly the strategy of a weaker opponent, but it works in nature. The bones of lynx and hare indistinguishable in death, each so perfectly the obverse of the other, each so necessary. Imagine that as Vermiculite Mountain up in the Yak is a garden, so too is the richest hill on earth a garden, one we likewise despoiled without moderation and in record time. Just as any place on a landscape where something really bad has happened makes a scar, so too can places where really fine things have happened leave a mark. It is that way in a life, and it must therefore be that way in a landscape to which we are so briefly and tenuously but significantly attached. One of my goals for the Kootenai watershed has long been for a grand biological survey, as if encountering that land for the first time. An exhaustive, scientifically replicable assay and inventory of every species' presence or absence, distribution and density, undertaken in the spirit of explorer Michael Fay's great transect of Africa. You can just look on the map and tell that the Yak is like a little Africa. Africa condensed to 1 million acres, with rich borders in every direction, unprecedented diversity, unique species relationships. 4 species of chickadees sharing the same habitat fringes, the rarest forms of old growth. The lowest elevation of grizzly bears left in the continental U.S., and yet grizzlies that also feed upon the winter-killed carcasses of mountain goats, arguing with golden and bald eagles over each summer's glacier-shrunk revelations of such mummified scraps. In extreme or unique ecosystems, extreme or unique adaptations evolve, as might extreme or unique stories. Sometimes, in dreaming of getting rid of your scars, you begin with a map. I remember as if it was only yesterday, Robin and Scott and me sitting in our little office and pointing to the 1 million-acre garden of the Yak and beginning to dream dreams. It was only yesterday. 20 years shot by. With regard to our idea of an inventory, we've missed our mark of the millennium by a decade. But it's all just numbers. We creep toward a reduced roster, reduced inventory of life, if and when we ever undertake one, without even knowing what we're losing. Things move slower up there in the Kootenai. The Clark Fork is fire country, but in the Kootenai we just rot. We move so much more slowly. While the rest of the West burns, the Yak may be the last place to stay wet and cool. Maybe if the time of heat and drought passes over us, the Yak will remain cool and wet and will act as a refuge from which new strength can be rebuilt after the heat is gone. Maybe. It's funny the way these two watersheds snug up tight against one another, so connected and integral, sewn or stitched together by the movements of the grizzly bears and mountain goats, the wolves and wolverine that travel back and forth from one to the other, and yet somehow having gotten to the same place in the story, injury, through different paths. The restoration in the Clark Fork involved a digging up and tearing out, while up in the Kootenai, we're talking about filling in and covering up, putting an impermeable clay cap over a giant hole in the top of a mountain that has already been dug out, a place that never should have been dug up in the first place. The biology of our afflictions, the convergence of metaphor, where our lives and mistakes become our illnesses, and our scars our birthrights. The forced move in a designed space that seems to suggest increasingly the presence of destiny. What does it mean? What are we to make of it? If Scott's carved out hip, excuse me, Scott's carved out hip represents only the backside curve of the mountains we've been able to protect up along the Canadian border with Senator Tester's brave bill. Part, but not yet all. It's enough for now. It's holding things together, a fragmented part scalloped for now out of what was previously a whole, still functioning, still intact if ailing, and yet we want and need more. And just a little farther south, also in the Yak, we've healed Robin. Now we need to heal Vermiculite Mountain. I'm not sure how. And what of all those little poisons, daily poisons, millions of pounds of ore removed each day for 50 years, now a swirl in the world? The poison hasn't gone away, it's merely being redistributed. We need to remember this. We need to find a story that deals with this reality and helps guide us and others through it. I wonder if we have to gain back every small poison one at a time, as if picking up pebbles to be encased in a vast sheet of ice or some other temporarily safe place, or absorbed by the trunks of trees and plants to be held still and stable for a while, and encased within the seal of clay, as if held within the bodies and the land's scar tissue. Such encasements, by ice or clay or tree or the animal body, will occur one breath at a time, one day at a time, one considered gesture at a time, one ceremony at a time. Such recovery will take generations. I imagine such concerted small steps flying from each of us like glittering dust in the wind, or like the millions of gold needles that fly from larch trees each fall, laying themselves down upon the fire-blackened September wet firescapes of the previous summer. The larch needles acting as a netting to hold together the sometimes damaged soil and beginning once more the process of rebuilding that which has gone away. The dust upon our lungs casts a net of poison, but there can be healing nets too. In a time of converging metaphors, as might have been the case in the beginning, back when the world was new, stories matter. In this, in our observation, imagination, and actions, we possess the double-edged power of responsibility, for the stories we embed into our culture will direct the flow and shape of the subsequent rivers of culture that follow the bounds and borders of these stories. Stories generally flow downhill. Much will follow them. How do we reverse a story of poison on the Kootenai? Clearly, by restoring, as you here on the Clark Fork have begun. Instead of imagining a trillion toxic fibers swirling through the air, being vacuumed into people's lungs with every breath inhaled, it might be helpful to imagine, to remember, 1,000 third and second order tributaries diving down into the main stem of the Clark Fork and bringing life, not death. I don't mean to counsel denial. There is poison in our past and poison in our lives. But I think it is important from a story perspective that in the next 25 to 50 years, we think of ourselves not as toxic victims, but survivors, restorationists. We can't control the future, but as Bill Kittredge reminds us, we can determine the stories we inhabit, stepping into the future and passing through it, I suppose, with the irretrievability of water flowing. And those stories certainly direct the course and nature of that river and the future, with the limit of the story's certain established boundaries. Every watershed in these 5 contiguous nation states, the Clark Fork, the Kootenai, the Salmon Snake, the St. Joe Coeur d'Alene, the Missouri Yellowstone, has poisons to extract and soil to heal, green gardens to grow to feed us, and wild forest, burning, rotting, growing young again, growing old again, on the mountain slopes above these rivers. Every watershed in the 5 nation states has a long list of threatened, endangered, and sensitive species, the recovery of which will also help restore various rust-bound or gridlocked ecological processes between species and landscape, with the movements of these animals between the 5 nations acting like sutures, stitches, sewing back together what's been injured. For some recoveries, we'll have to be as creative and imaginative and committed as we know how. I'm sure there are biologists who, frustrated from working long years with the VQRs at Libby Dam, would swear that it is easier for a fat man to pass through the eye of a needle than to manage water flows and wildly different needs simultaneously for spawning Kootenai River sturgeon, an endangered species, and bull trout, while also addressing flood control and power generation. A fine mess we've gotten ourselves into with our incessant and bottomless hungers. Maybe another vision for the next 25 to 50 years is one where we're not quite so hungry, or rather hungrier for different things inside us rather than the ores and metals of the earth. A vision of more spirit and spirituality and a little less taking. Maybe a lot less taking. I know that's asking a lot. Most of our stories are old stories that simply play themselves over with but slight reassembly of the primal elements. There are few new things under the sun. We pretty much need to keep building our new stories with our old words. I like it that the Clark Fork exists just a little north of Wisdom and a little south of Paradise. I like that there's a town called Heron along its banks, and caught too in the net of our geography are words like Superior and Trout Creek, Sweat House and Hellgate. In this story fits reality notion, this biology of restoration becoming a fitting match with the biology of the affliction. It occurs to me that groups like the Clark Fork Coalition and the Yak Valley Forest Council are gathering momentum like a river, and that each of us are those swirling fibers or those tiny tributaries coming down from out of the mountains to join it and feed into it. You may think that like a bear or an elk you are coming down to water's edge for only a drink, but you're doing something more. Somehow, and I'm not quite sure how this works, you are repairing the river, stitching it back, and to someone who likes to stay up on the ridges and look down at it, I thank you. My own visions are tame little next step things. My visions are of things I can already see. When the Dalai Lama comes to Montana next year, I want to see him bless not just the Clark Fork, but the Kootenai with its corporate crimes, its civil rights abuses. Maybe he can convene other religious leaders. There is already an economic and environmental and increasingly scientific consciousness of the Clark Fork and its watershed. It makes sense to me that the next phase should call for explicit acknowledgement of the river's importance to the spirits of things. In the end, excuse me. In the end, call me unimaginative, but the only thing I have to request of the future then, really, is that those other inhabitants beyond ourselves are secure in the watershed. I'm more of a bear guy than a trout guy. I lean more toward rock than water. I really don't even like to get my feet wet. I wish I had more to ask for in and of the future. It makes me feel like a not very good environmentalist to not have a robust and complicated 50-year battle plan, particularly with so much technology available to us now. But I know there are great scientists and artists and activists and business people and leaders out there who do have such battle plans. I guess all I'd ask of them is to please remember to make sure a bear can come down from out of the Yak and make it into the Bitterroot, then Yellowstone, then the Wind Rivers. The Wind Rivers, what a lovely name. In the old days, the name Clark Fork meant poison, meant destruction, meant greed and abuse, meant the failure to preserve that which was once special. Now the name Clark Fork has currency again, and I thank you for letting me live here for a while, and I apologize again for the tameness or even absence of my vision. I'm the one who wears a life jacket in the inner tube. A vision? You've invited the wrong person tonight, but you've got the next 50 years to correct that. It's a big watershed with lots of challenges, and I suspect you'll need almost every one of those 50 years, if not more. But from where I am, looking down through the trees, it sure seems like you're on the right track. We might even get out of this alive. Thank you.
I wear a life jacket when I'm in the Clark Fork, too. I did want to thank all our speakers tonight and remind everybody that we'll be the registration table and some muffins and coffee and stuff will be here at 8:30, and that we'll be starting promptly with a panel at 9 o'clock.